Altered Carbon episode 3. Right, a fair few developments in this episode. Again, we learn more about the sort of society and the world we're living in. We're getting a bit deeper into the complicated structure that society is, with these whole stacks and sleeves and religion and everything that goes on with it. It's clearly quite a complicated, deep, messy society. More probably complicated and messy than the one we've already got, to be honest. And we also get to see much more of the sort of the elite side of society in this one, in the sort of dinner party towards the end of the episode. We see they're very much separated from the world that they're sort of in. I mean, they live above the clouds, for example. And you even got one bit where there was a guy moaning about the fact that, in essence, having to live forever, he's stuck with these same people for eternity. You know, the burden that is, which I suppose is probably a little bit annoying, especially if people are really annoying. But trying to explain that to anybody who hasn't got that privilege, it does sound like a whole load of crap. Now, getting into the episode, it opens up with Kovac and his sister, sort of flashback to when they were younger, reading this sort of horror story about the Patchwork Man or something like that, which is sort of kind of a Frankenstein story in essence, and this monster that gets loose. And then we sort of discover they go and hide in this cupboard because their mother and, as we discover sort of later on, I believe, father sort of come home, or are already home, but they're fighting, and it would appear that he's been quite an abusive father, certainly to the mother and maybe to the kids as well. And they make a little pact at that point about always sort of staying together and never doing anything sort of by yourselves. And that does play on in the episode a little bit later on, towards the very end actually. But yeah, this whole bit was quite good. It was quite interesting seeing him younger. I might be overlooking into things here, but with seeing him younger, then that means that the Kovac that we've seen as the sort of the Oriental gentleman was his original self, I guess, because we see him as a kid. I don't know if I'm right to assume that, but that's kind of what I gauged from that as well. So yeah, that was quite interesting, seeing a little bit more of the background of his life when he was younger. Okay, the other bit that I sort of noticed is Ortega again. She's obviously got a bigger issue with Bancroft than just the average person. That was sort of picked up on slightly, but more to do with the thing that I was mentioning towards the end of my last review, with this blonde girl who drops out of the water. And we've seen maybe a few sort of scenes a bit like this, where they just sort of been dropping out of the water, and how she sort of ended up being back at the police station. It was not too much about it, but Ortega does seem to be looking into this a little bit. It was sort of pointed out in the episode that this isn't her case at all. So she's sort of going beyond her normal parameters as usual. That seems to be the way she operates, to be honest. But yeah, again, she's sort of looking into this a bit more. And, you know, why are these bodies falling out of the sky? This is, I think, certainly going to develop. We're getting little bits and pieces about this story. I assume it's probably linked to the main story, or maybe it's something completely separate from what we're actually doing in terms of the sort of murder investigation. We'll see how that develops. But yeah, there were a few little bits in there. And also I mentioned about the sort of religion and stuff in the previous episode. Her partner, or sort of partner in there, he mentioned how he was sort of Muslim. We also got a mention of Neo-Catholicism from Bancroft. So yeah, religion is deeply influential, it would seem, within this society, as well as everything else that's going on that we already see with the whole stack and sleeve and money and AI and all sorts of debauchery. It's a pretty crazy universe that we're seeing here. Now, in terms of Kovac and his investigation into who killed Bancroft, that's sort of pushed on a little bit. Certainly we've learned a little bit more towards later on at the dinner party that does have quite a big influence on potential people that may well have carried this out, or potentially maybe anybody to an extent, but I'll get into that in a bit. But Kovac enlists the help of Elliot, who we obviously met in the previous episode, and basically says to him that he will investigate more into the Lizzie situation, Elliot's daughter, and try and find out what happened. But he also mentioned to Elliot that he didn't believe that Bancroft was the one responsible for that. I'm not sure he was telling the truth when he said that to Elliot, quite frankly. We'll see how that develops, but I kind of got the feeling that, I don't know, from the last episode, I didn't kind of get the impression that Bancroft definitely was crossed off the list of potential suspects for that. Very much looked like a very strong candidate. Maybe I missed something, but that was what I interpreted from that whole scene. And one of the other things Kovac offers to Elliot is to move his daughter from the sort of the AI thing that she's in at Elliot's place to the sort of brothel hotel where Pope, the AI, and where Kovac is staying is, and they'll sort of set up a kind of AI room or whatever. And then he also got Pope earlier in the episode to upload some sort of skills or something, so then he could maybe help her out. It's quite interesting seeing that how Pope could well be, and already is, proven to be quite a useful asset actually for Kovac, and especially if he can upload these different things straight off the bat, and then he's got these abilities. He seems to be sort of somewhat constrained, obviously, to the hotel, although I think even though he was sort of making out he was, I don't think he really is. He can get other places to an extent, but they'd have to be terminals or something, I imagine. Again, see how that develops. But yeah, so Elliot signs up to sort of helping Kovacs out, kind of being his wingman, so to speak, with the fact that Kovacs said he's obviously going to look into the Lizzie's death further, which I'm not sure he's really going to bother, and also this whole Pope thing, which did seem to actually, as the episode went on a little bit, did seem to be getting a little bit of progress, and Lizzie did actually speak briefly to Pope and said something about stealing the stars or something like that. Again, I feel like that might have a bit more of an influence on things than we realise. We'll see how that part develops too. Now, getting into the main part of the episode, the sort of dinner party, so to speak. As I've already sort of mentioned, one of the things we got quite a bit from this was sort of seeing a bit more about the elite society that Bancroft's obviously part of, and these people that just in essence live forever and seem to control more or less everything. But what we also sort of learn within that is this whole ownership thing that goes on as well. As we we kind of know it, but we discover it more. Kovacs is very much Bancroft's property, and we have other examples of this. And there's something about some sort of serial rapist or something who has been, his mind or consciousness has been put into this snake or something this woman had. Didn't quite get that, but in essence, what we're learning is they can kind of do what they like, and they sort of seem to sort of buy sort of relics of the past, sort of memories, their stacks, and do what they will with them. They sort of then have that as their ownership, which is, just even more messy and murky compared to what we already got. So it's quite a complicated setup, the way everything works. But yes, it certainly we get from this, as if we didn't already know, Kovacs is Bancroft's property. He's not an individual as such. He's very much Bancroft's property. Not that Kovacs will accept that, and I'm sure he'll be able to work a way around that. Beyond that, Kovacs was sent there, from what he understood, to further investigate, because the people that Bancroft invited to this party were in essence all the suspects that might be capable of his murder, of which there were quite a few family members there. But Kovacs was concerned that the reason he was being asked there is because Bancroft had found out about him banging his wife at the end of the last episode, because as Pope mentioned earlier in the episode, someone had sort of hacked the system or whatever and was spying on them. And as we sort of discovered, Bancroft did know that, or at least he suspected that Kovacs was banging his wife, and we sort of learn that he kind of doesn't mind too much his wife banging other people, but she won't be banging Kovacs any longer. So that's off the cards, or at least that's what Bancroft says anyway. We'll see how that develops. But in terms of Bancroft's wife banging Kovacs, we also got to see her banging one of the hired help, a waiter or something. She sort of snuck off away from the party, and Kovacs sort of discovered that and basically broke it up. But he also sort of quickly picked up on the fact that she didn't seem to know who he was, which was kind of unusual, because at least either the night before or a couple of nights ago, obviously they were banging. So he's like, "Who are you?" And eventually it comes out that she isn't Bancroft's wife. She's actually the 12th daughter, using one of her mother's sleeves to basically go about and do what the fuck she likes, it would seem. Which obviously opens up a whole can of worms in terms of different suspects now, because one of the things that was sort of pointed out in the first episode is there's only two people that could shoot this gun, in essence, that was used to kill Bancroft and his wife. Well, if his wife's body is doing it, it's not necessarily his wife. Certainly it could be, from what we gather from this, any one of his children, which he seems to have many of, and it was sort of put across in this episode, they're kind of sort of held at a certain kind of age in a way, not as in they're not allowed to age any further, but he doesn't let them sort of expand their wings enough, Bancroft that is. He's got quite an oppressive sort of hold over these children, probably because he doesn't want any of them to surpass him. I think in terms of this particular daughter, I think she might have mentioned she was sort of 63 or whatever, so she's no spring chicken. So yeah, that develops, in terms of the whole investigation, everything opens up a whole load of other possibilities. And in terms of the TV series itself, even though it was already, like I was saying, pretty complicated and murky, nobody is necessarily who they seem they are. And now the sort of the final main bit to sort of pick up on in terms of the dinner party, another sort of dark part of this society, was that Bancroft had set up this fight between a married couple, basically. They'd signed up for this. It was interesting actually, because Ortega was checking their fighting licenses earlier, so you have to have a license to be able to fight, otherwise you wouldn't be able to compete in this. What ends up happening is basically these two have got to fight each other to the death, and then the one who loses gets a new sleeve and an upgrade. So that's their sort of payment for doing this. And all these rich people and stuff basically stand around the kind of the arena and watch it go on. So it's very much that sort of Roman debauchery of the sort of the arena and sort of watching people die and stuff. to entertain the elites. That was sort of quite interesting. And also Bancroft, if you ever watched it, was Mark Antony in Rome, so he does have some previous in this as well, to be fair. But as the fight goes on, Kovac decides he's had enough of this, basically watching this wife get beaten to death by her husband, which is, understandable. So he actually intervenes, which then turns into a fight between him and those two. And as it sort of develops, Ortega basically calls the whole thing off, and Kovac very politely kills the husband so then they can get the replacement sleeve, and Bancroft lives up to that. But the reason I sort of bring all of this up is because, again, it gave us a bit more depth of how this upper society sort of works and views other people, but also just what goes on in this world. I mean, the fact there are actually official licenses to do this sort of fighting just shows it's all above board and legal. It's not something that's actually underground or anything. So that was all quite interesting. And then the final bit is Kovac going back to see I forget her name, but the girl that he got the information from about Lizzie from the brothel in the previous episode. He was pretending to be Lizzie's mother again, and he was sort of knocking on the door. She sort of let him in and then drugged him. And then we saw the same big Russian bloke or whatever he was from the previous episode who was trying to beat up Kovac, and another guy who I do recognise from the trailer actually. And this is kind of interesting because they then take Kovac off to some sort of medical place or something like that. It's not entirely clear, and sort of drug him up. And just as he's sort of kind of going out or coming to, I can't quite remember now, we see this guy with the sort of Mohican and the sort of Frankenstein monster picture that we saw for that patchwork guy at the start. Now, I don't know how much meaning there is in that, but from the trailer bit as well, I did see that this guy's face kind of seems to sort of disorientate at one point, as if it's maybe like a kind of digital mask or something. So yeah, it sort of left the episode on not exactly a cliffhanger, but we don't know where Kovac is. He's been sort of taken out of his thing. We know that these people have been hunting him down. I'm not sure if they're the same group that were looking for him at the end of the first episode, where we had the sort of the shootout in the brothel. But certainly it's the same people that were to do with the end of the last episode when he got into the fight with the guy wearing the whole sort of body amplifier thing, or whatever you want to call it. So in conclusion, the pace and everything seems to be going on quite nicely. We sort of learnt more about society and stuff, a little bit more about the characters, but I felt more we sort of learnt about the society, maybe a bit more about the Bancroft family, and also the sort of the variables that have now sort of opened up in terms of who could potentially be a realistic suspect, because in essence it was just Bancroft and his wife. Obviously it wasn't, but now we've got, I guess, any one of the children that could be potentially the murderer or potential murderer of their father. So as the final score for this episode, I will give it a 7 out of 10.